cortisol belly, that midsection pudge that just won't budge no matter how much you diet or exercise. What you need to do. Sounds crazy, huh? You see, when you severely restrict your calories or do intense workouts, these are considered as stress by your body. So what does the body do? Well, it produces more cortisol to deal with that stress, and that makes the problem even worse. So
let's talk specifically about the role of exercise in cortisol and cortisol belly fat accumulation. It is true that chronically elevated cortisol is related to an increase in abdominal obesity. With that being said, the first line of evidence that contradicts what was said in this video is that although during exercise cortisol is elevated, there appears to be a depression in cortisol for the following 24 to 48 hours. Which means in the next 1 to 2 days, there will probably be a net reduction in total cortisol output. When we talk specifically about cortisol, cortisol has some interesting actions on body fat and body fat metabolism. Cortisol stimulates whole body lipolysis, which is the release of fat mainly from subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue. Interestingly, it actually appears that cortisol increases the uptake of fat in adipose tissue as well. However, this effect is much more pronounced in the visceral adipose tissue, which is actually underneath the subcutaneous adipose tissue surrounding the organs, and does actually lead to a belly protrusion. However, this isn't the type of pinchable, more jiggly fat that was shown in this video. And this visceral fat tissue is actually slightly resistant to the lipolytic effects of cortisol, meaning in states of elevated cortisol, there is a net lipogenic effect on visceral adipose tissue. With that being said, physical activity increases the activity of a specific enzyme on skeletal muscle called lipoprotein lipase. The main function of this enzyme is to take fatty acids out of the bloodstream. And because we see a diversion of blood flow towards skeletal muscle away from the abdominal region during exercise, we would expect that more of these fatty acids during exercise would be delivered to the skeletal muscle rather than the visceral abdominal fat. And this is supported by essentially every piece of literature that we have about the role of physical activity on abdominal fat mass. Physical activity decreases the uptake of fatty acids in the adipocytes, and the high-intensity exercise, which induced the largest increase in cortisol, appear to actually have the most pronounced effects at reducing total abdominal fat, subcutaneous abdominal fat, and visceral fat. Essentially, when we have elevations in cortisol in response to physical stressors such as exercise, there is an increased demand for fatty acids in the skeletal muscle, which means that the available fatty acids in the bloodstream will be uptaken and utilized by the skeletal muscle, resulting in a net decrease in abdominal fat. However, if for some reason we have chronically elevated levels of cortisol in response to a mental or physiological stressor such as an infection, because the skeletal muscles do not have an increased demand for fatty acids, it's more likely that these fatty acids will remain in the bloodstream and be uptaken by visceral fat tissue, contributing to an increase in visceral fat mass. However, we cannot correlate what occurs during chronic elevations in cortisol due to non-energy intensive stressors with the elevation and subsequent depression in cortisol that occurs during and after exercise.